Okay, so what did we learn yesterday? That just like we can't understand Hashem's power, which is a creative power, chesed, the power that creates the world and creates things in creation, and that power creates yesh me'ayin. Yesh me'ayin only so we humans not only cannot do anything like that, but we can't even comprehend it, we can't understand it. It's beyond our comprehension. At the same time, the attribute of Gevura of Hashem, which withholds the light and hides the light and doesn't allow the light to be seen, is also something which is totally impossible for us to understand. It's inconceivable for humans to understand how that happens. So we explained yesterday what is it about Gevura that also is inconceivable, and we say it's only Hashem can do that. We explained it because it's not the kind of Gevura that we know in our human experience. And the Gevura we know is the ability to conceal something, to withhold something. When we withhold information or withhold whatever it may be, emotion, thought, concepts, it's actually being withheld, meaning it never arrives, it never becomes sort of received by the recipient. That's how we withhold things. By Hashem, we can't say that because his light and his energy and the creative force is in each object, and it's in there in a way that it penetrates every single aspect of it, and it's also every single moment. It's not a moment without it, and the entire being, entire existence is only because of it, and at the same time, it's totally as if it's totally non-existent. And that kind of withholding, we have no concept how that's possible. As far as we're concerned, it's just a contradiction of words. It doesn't make any sense. It's similar to, remember the subject we spoke about regarding, could Hashem have an element pass through the hole of a needlehead? And everyone agrees that Hashem can make a nest, that an elephant becomes as thin as a piece of thread and goes through the needlehead and comes out of the other side and it's alive. And everyone agrees that Hashem can make a needle, the hole of a needle should stretch out the size of an elephant. The elephant goes through and it doesn't break. These are two miracles. But could Hashem make a miracle that the elephant doesn't get any smaller and the hole of the needle doesn't get any bigger, and the elephant goes right through it? As far as people are concerned, as far as logic is concerned, it's like babbling. It doesn't make any sense. It's a contradiction of words, of terms. But the truth is, this is something which the Ramban talks about, and it says, for Hashem, there are no limitations. He can do this as well. So in a sense, we're saying something similar here. To say that Hashem's light is in every creation, it penetrates every single aspect in it, every fiber of its being is being penetrated. Good morning. With the Dvar Havaya.
You refer me to there.
Yes. I got to do it at least once a week, The Dvar Havaya penetrates every fiber of its being. And not only penetrates, but it's what sustains it, what creates it, and creates it yesh miyayin. And if it go away, it's totally dependent on it, like 100%. And at the same time, it's totally hidden as if it doesn't exist at all. And that's the kind of thing that is also a sort of a contradiction of terms almost. It's there and it's not there at the same time. And that only Hashem himself can do. Page 49, that's what we're up to. Even though Chayrezel didn't look ahead, but she did guess we are coming to a part in Shaar Hayichud, which is extremely, we're not going to go too far. We're going to finish with chapter 4, but the last part of chapter 4 is a very big subject in Chassidus, and the Rebbe once gave a beautiful, beautiful explanation to the whole thing. Other than that, it's like very hard to understand. So I'll try to explain it. They do have it here in lessons in Tanya. So maybe after I give the class, you'll look at it and try to read it and understand it. But let's look at the words. 49. This tzimtzum that we're talking about, and this concealment of Hashem's chayes, Hashem's life force, nikr b'shem kelim. In Kabbalistic terms, it's called kelim, vessels. And the chayes itself, which means the light of Hashem that creates the world, the creating force, nikr b'shem that's called And the analogy is, just like a vessel covers up on that which is in it, in the same way, tzimtzum covers up, it covers up the light that's in it and that flows. And what is kelim? Let's turn the page. What is kelim? The kelim, these are the letters that we spoke about in the first chapter, that Hashem speaks, and Hashem spoke and speaks the 10 utterances, the Asar Maimoris, and these are the letters, they're like kelim. Then he goes on to say, and where do the kelim come from? What's their source? Sharshan, the root of the kelim is Hein Oisius Mansapach. The 5 letters of Mansapach. What's Mansapach?
Is that like what the sounds of the words come out of?
That's the next line. Mansapach are the 5 letters of the alphabets, that each one of them has a final letter. Mem has a final mem, Nun has a final Nun, Tzadik has a final Tzadik, Pei has a final Tzadik, and Chov. There are only 5 such letters. So the source of the kelim is from the 5 letters. Okay, we're still in the Kabbalah realm. The next line, Shehein Hei Gevuris. This is the part that you mentioned. Now the 5 letters, Mansapach, they come from 5 categories of Gevura. Hamachalkos, Mafridus, Ahebel, Vahakel. These 5 Gevuras, they are what divide the sound, the breath, and the voice that comes from the person, comes from the mouth, and as a result of that, this Havas Chavbez Isis, that branches out, that gets divided into 22 letters. We're not finished. The Shaar Hayichud Vehaemunah, and what's the root of the 5 Gevuras? So the Kelim are the Isis. The Isis come from Mansapach. Mansapach comes from the 5 Gevuras. And where do the 5 Gevuras come from? Shaar Hayichud Vehaemunah, the Karbanisa. It's a term in Kabbalah, a certain level, which is called Botzino de Karbanisa. And as you see in the English, the way this is translated is light from darkness. Even in Chassidus, even in Maimarim, you'll hardly find this word. Tanya, in this chapter, as far as I can remember, I think is the only place I ever saw this in all my years, where it should use this term. And the Rebbe asks an obvious question here. What is going on? Now the Rebbe explained everything already, Tzimtzum, how it works. And then it looks like he's now going to explain something in Kabbalah. Then in Kabbalah, it says that the Tzimtzum is called the vessels. Okay, so what are the vessels? Let's explain that. The vessels are the letters. Well, let's explain that. Where do they come from? Oh, they come from the Hei Gevuras, from the Mansapach. Where does that come from? That comes from Hei Gevuras. Where does that come from? Butzinu de Kardanisa. Okay, so I know something in Kabbalah. What is it doing here in Shaar Hayichud Vehaemunah? The Alter Rebbe writes that this sefer is here to explain Hashem's unity. Hashem and the world is one. That's the whole point. And therefore, everything that is explained up until this point is all about that. The first chapter explains how the world can't exist without Hashem's words. The second chapter explains the reason, because it's Yesh Mi'ayin. The third chapter explains that if that's the case, then the world should be totally bottled to Hashem. And the fourth chapter explains how it's not batla because of the tzimtzum and gevura. Okay, this all explains how the world is really one with Hashem, and the fact that we see it otherwise is because of tzimtzum. That's where it should have stopped. This whole piece is not understood, like what is it doing here? That's number one. Number two, you notice that it begins with a bracket. V'hine, there's a bracket there. Very strange. At the end of the chapter, there is no bracket that's closing. Where's the end? And then the Rebbe goes on, which you don't have it in front of you, but there's a chapter 5. And chapter 5, almost also from beginning to end, is all different things in Kabbalah. So the Rebbe explains that the Alter Rebbe, after giving his explanation, is now going to answer a question, a very basic question, a general question on everything that was explained before. It's misunderstood, and therefore it has to be explained. And in order to explain that, he brings these things from Kabbalah. However, chapter 5 is still a continuation to chapter 4. So at the end of chapter 5, we don't have in front of you, but you'll see there's a bracket there. Because in chapter 5, at the end, there's also something in a bracket. And the Rebbe says something very interesting, that apparently the Alter Rebbe had 2 brackets at the end of chapter 5. One was the closing bracket of something in chapter 5, and the other is the closing bracket of what began here in chapter 4. Because from the beginning of the bracket till the end of chapter 5, there's one subject that's being explained. When they printed it, apparently the one who printed the Tanya saw 2 brackets. He figured one must be extra, so he took one out. But really, one bracket is the closing bracket that started here, and the other bracket is for chapter 5 itself. There's something in a bracket. So what is this big issue that needs to be explained, that's not understood? And I'll try to see how we can explain it.
We put a bracket in this copy at the end of chapter 4. I don't know if they added that, but.
End of chapter 4, bracket?
Yeah, the last page.
Interesting. Look at the bottom, 14. So they're right that the Rebbe once wrote that looks like there was a mistake. There needs to be a bracket here. And then years later, the Rebbe said there's a deeper way of explaining it, that actually the bracket to this is the end of chapter 5. But if you look in the original Tanyas, you don't find the bracket there at the end.
But why? Why didn't they fix the situation?
Because a bracket here means that this subject is finished. The Rebbe is explaining that the whole entire next chapter 5 is a continuation of what's being talked about in this chapter. We won't be able to go into all that. That's going to be more than we can handle here. But I'm going to try to explain everything in chapter 4 as much as we can. So, what's the question? And again, if you look in chapter 5, there's an introduction there, and that introduction is the Rebbe's explanation. It's a few pages. The question that's here is as follows. In the beginning of the chapter, in the beginning of chapter 4, Alter Rebbe used the analogy of the sun and the shield, which means look at the sun gives light, and the shield is like a filter. The Tanya's running away from you. What's going on? What is a shield? A shield is a magen. Who can say it in Russian? Dvora, you don't know Russian? No.
I don't know. Like when you go to a wall, you have a door and a sheet. I'm saying in Portuguese.
Oh, it's cool.
Oh. It's cool.
No, just cool.
Oh, I knew it. I just know the modern Russian. I don't know the old Russian. So the Alter Rebbe says it's like the sun and the shield. So the sun gives light, And the shield is in front of it, so to speak, and blocks light, just like Begashmis. You have a light. If this glass would be, let's say, tinted, darker, so it's dark in the room because the light is reduced, the amount of light becomes less because of what's blocking. That's the same thing with them. So the Rebbe has a question. The question is like this. If that's the case, that means that the attribute of Gevura is not proactive in any way. It's just a filter, just blocking the light, but everything that's happening is coming from the light. If that's the case, then where are all the things in the world that are, all the differences in the world and everything that's limited in the world, where is that coming from? Hashem's light is believable, is infinite. And as far as that's concerned, everything should be infinite. So we're saying, where does finite come from? From Tzimtzum. But Tzimtzum is not a substance. Tzimtzum is just a blocking agent. It stops the light. So that means that the Tzimtzum is just something which doesn't let us see the reality. And if that's the case, that would mean that all the differences we see and all the finite we see and the fact that we see the world as an independent entity, all that is not really emes, because the emes is the way the light is creating the world, which is infinite. And the fact that we see all these things is just because we don't see the light as it is. So that would mean that, in a sense, the world is not a true existence the way we see it.
Rabbi Majeski, do you remember if you classically told that every person has his limit of reaching the light of Hashem, of accepting the light of Hashem? And for example, what about kids who are not obligated till a specific age to perform mitzvahs, so they're not actually sinning? So what their relationship with the light of Hashem? Like, how do kids feel this?
The truth is, that's another subject, but if you ask the question, kids actually are aware of Hashem in a way even more than adults. Kids are very innocent, very believing, very trusting, and they believe in Hashem. When you tell a child about a miracle, he gets all excited. You tell something to an adult, he starts questioning, maybe, yes, no. Okay, children are more receptive to godliness because the seichel interferes, the seichel blocks. But basically, children are not obligated to do mitzvahs, but at the same time, every time they do a mitzvah, because they're being trained, they're absorbing godliness. They're learning Torah, they're absorbing godliness. It's like planting a seed. And when they grow up, they're going to see what grows out of the seed that they planted. So getting back to the question, what we're asking is, where is the source of all the finite differences in this world? It's not from the light, because the light is infinite. It's not from Shem Elokim, because Shem Elokim doesn't create. Shem Elokim is just a blocker. So where's it coming from?
From the source himself. No, that's what we explained.
What?
From the source himself, that's what we explained.
Right, well, we're asking a question. The source is believable, is infinite. In the source, there are no details, there are no differences, and all the differences we say come from Shem Elokim. But Shem Elokim is not something which creates things. Shem Elokim just blocks the light. So that means that what we see in all the differences is not emes, because it's not really coming from. We can't say that this was created by Hashem because Hashem is believable. We can't say it's created by the Shem Elokim because Shem Elokim doesn't create. Shem Elokim is just a filter that blocks the light. It doesn't make anything happen. It just stops things from happening. It's passive. So where does all the gvul, all the limitations in this world, where does the differences come from between all the millions of different things and species? And where does it come from that we see ourselves as a separate entity, unless it means that it's not true? The truth is that everything is really infinite. It only appears to be finite because we're not seeing the emes. But that would mean that the whole world is not really emes. Yeah?
So, I don't know if this is already said, is it us? Is it like our...
But that would mean that it's not true. That's my question.
Not necessarily.
If it's just me perceiving it, but not real, from Hashem's end, that means it's not emes, and it's a bigger question. That means everything about Torah is not emes. The esrog isn't the real esrog, and the lulav is not a real lulav, and the tefillin is not a real tefillin, the mezuzah is not a real. Nothing is real. It's all a figment of someone's imagination.
But if it's like just because you're perceiving it that way, it's real for the individual, right?
We'd have to say something like that, but it still means that in essence it's not emes. How could that be?
It's not the letters, האותיות מושכות את האור של השם כמו צינור, and then הן מהוות את העולם.
Oh, you're speaking Hebrew. I gotta switch channels. Okay, say it again.
Sorry, I can't say English. I don't know.
I thought you were saying very sophisticated English words and then engaged. Yeah.
אז זה לא שהאותיות מושכות לנו את אור השם, הן בונות את העולם כמו צינור, ואז הן מהוות את העולם, ודרך ההוויה של האותיות אנחנו מקבלים את העולם. זה גם איך שהאדם ידע את כל השמות של החיות.
That's what we said before. אבל השאלה הוא, האותיות, הכלים, הם לא, אין להם את כוח של בריאה, they're not creating. הם רק מעכבים, מונעים ומעכבים את האור. They hold back something. So השאלה שלנו, מאיפה בא all the inyanim of gevul in the world? Where's that all coming from? It's not from the light, because light is infinite. It's not from the tzimtzum, because the tzimtzum doesn't create. So you must say it's from the fact that the tzimtzum. I'll give you an example. What's a shadow?
What?
Shadow.
Not like
Blocking the light.
Tzeil.
walking like, yeah.
Ken. זה לא מישהו ברא צל. צל זה הדר האור. יש אור, משהו מפריע, איך you say, blocking the light from shining, and that's this form. So there's a black spot, which is light being blocked, but it's not a creation of something. So is that what the world is? That really Hashem shines his light, believable, infinite, and because it's not revealed, so therefore we think and we see something which is finite. But then that would mean that everything is not emes, and it can be.
צמצום זה עושה השתלשלות.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it from Hashem's external will? Like Tanya's about time?
Yes, but the whole point in the pair was to explain, okay, it's Hashem's external will, but explaining the process that all happens through tzimtzum. But the process that we are explaining doesn't explain. It only explains that the world should be perceived as finite, should be perceived as something separate, but it's not emes.
Was that what creates klipa? Like just
Klipa is even a worse perception than ours. Klipa is like literally seeing itself as if it has its own independent power totally from Hashem, but it's the same idea, just more extreme.
Is it the Botzina de Carotoni?
But you got it right there. It's Botzina de Cardonisa. That's the answer.
Thank you.
Now we know. Okay, you just saved me hours of explaining. Okay, so let's try to see how the Rebbe explains it. The Rebbe says the answer to this question is by saying that the Kalim are the Oisius. That Tzimtzum is Kalim, and that Tzimtzum is Kalim. What does that help? So there's a Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim is from the Arizal. When he talks about Tzimtzum, he actually uses the mashal of Kalim vessels. What mashal does he give? He uses a mashal, I think, with water, but maybe we'll use a mashal of light because it'll be easier to follow. If you have light, and the same would be with water or light, and you put it into a green glass, what light will be in the room?
It's gonna look green.
It's going to look green. And if you have a red glass, it'll look red. And if you have a blue glass, it'll look blue. All these differences. The light doesn't really change. The light remains the same. But because the light goes through this green glass, so therefore we perceive it as green. But it's not just perceiving, it really is green. But it's only green in our perception, but not in essence. The light in essence hasn't really changed. And that's the mashal that Eitz Chaim uses for Tzimtzum, that Hashem shines his light. His light is infinite. He shines it through these vessels, which is Tzimtzum, which means what difference of what I'm saying now, what we said before we explained that Tzimtzum is just a filter, which means it doesn't do anything. It's not proactive in any way. It's just something that blocks. It blocks the light. It holds back the light. when you look at it this way, the green in the glass, or the green in the glass that's on top of the light, is actually doing something. It produces a light that's green. It produces a light that's red. But at the same time, the light itself hasn't changed. It only produces it in our perception. That from our reality, it is really, truly green, red, or blue. It's not imagination, it's real. But it's only real for our perception, not in essence. The light didn't make any essential changes. So that would mean that Hashem's light is infinite. It was infinite, it is infinite, it remains infinite, and yet creates a world that's finite. And the finite part, that comes from Hashem's attribute of Gevura. So Gevura is not just a filter that blocks light. Gevura is also a power to create things in a Gevura way. And that's where all the different, that's why it's called Oisius. And these are the letters that make all the difference, that this is a cow, and this is a giraffe, and this is a lion, and this is a sheep, and this is a person, and this is a tree. All these differences come from the Oisius. And what is the Oisius? The Oisius are the vessels that they cause that in our perception, it should have a form and a shape and a finite, and should also be seen as a separate, independent entity of Hashem.
So in this case, the Gevura was the flesh?
Yeah.
And the Tzimtzum was...
The Tzimtzum is the Gevura, the same thing. Gevura, Tzimtzum, vessels, Oisius, they're all the same thing in different words.
Isn't that like the spheroids that like each one is like a keli that?
So this is the question: how could there be a sphere of Chesed? Hashem is infinite; He's not Chesed. So it starts from the beginning that Hashem initially, the Gevura Tzimtzum up there again doesn't change Hashem's essential light; it's still infinite. But for the purpose of creation and from the perspective of creation, we see something which is Chesed, another thing which is Gevura, another thing which is the Tiferes. Hashem himself is not Chesed, not Gevura, not Tiferes, not Netzach, not Hod, but the world is created in such a way that it perceives it as these things.
Okay.
This is a mashal and a thought that we have to chew over a lot to really get it, and even then we don't really get it.
So wait, I have a question. So like I'm wondering how it gets from this process from like light bleed wool to being shown through like a filter of sorts, like a keli. That's like is that the letters that then create like a shore, like a ox, and then
and in other words, it starts all the way on top. There's letters. Malchus of Atzilus is also letters in a higher form. Malchus of Bria is letters in a lower form. Malchus of Yitzira is letters in a lower form. Malchus of Asiya, through that, what's channeled through that comes into being something begashmis. But they're all, that's Hashem's speech. Malchus is always Hashem's speech. But there's different letters, just like we have thought, speech, writing, and so on. Yeah.
So, just to clarify, to make sure I get it, it's like, so when I'm studying in college, it's like you have your voice, right? And you say something, and the different parts of the mouth, like the articulators, they shape it. So it's still the same noise, it's just changed a bit, but it's kind of going through.
Well, in that case, the sound is the same sound. The voice is the same voice.
The voice is the same.
But it takes on a different form as it goes through, as it's channeled through different parts of the mouth. This is the Zayin sound, this is the Lamed sound, this is the Mem sound.
Is that, am I getting it right? Like
Well, this mashal is a little bit more accurate than that mashal. It's better to think of this mashal to try to connect to it. That it's like the vessel with the light that comes out of it. What makes it better understood is that in this case, the green on the other side of the glass is real, what I see, and at the same time, the light in essence hasn't really changed. I think we see it more clearly with that.
So each letters that are in, like you said before, like Malchus and Tzilos and then Malchus and Bria down to the in between, it just that like the letters of Malchus and Tzilos have like more capacity to like allow more of Hashem's light to shine through, than each level going down has like less.
Yes.
It's like filters between each.
Right, and all the differences, all the gazillion things that exist in the world of Bria, even though Hashem is infinite, where is it coming from? Because when it goes through Malchus, it all takes on different forms and shapes and different levels, and that's the symptom.
Malchus of Atzilus down to Bria.
Right, and then in the next world there's another symptom. Next world is another symptom, and the final symptom brings a world which is our physical world with all its forms and shapes and finite.
How does it get to Gashmias?
What?
How does it get
That's
to
the Yeshmiyayin. That's what we said last time. That's the part which is the infinite power of Hashem. So this explains the first line. The first line was that Tzimtzum is Kalim, and the life force is Ur. With these words, it brings us to the mashal of the Kalim. So when we say Kalim, it's not a filter. Again, Mogen, which means a shield. The shield is just blocking. Shield doesn't do anything. Kalim do something. Kalim can cause the light to take on a different form and a different shape and a different color.
It is active.
Yeah. In other words, when the light goes through a green vessel, the green part comes from the vessel, not from the light. But at the same time, there couldn't be any green light if there wouldn't be any light. So the source of the light in the room is definitely the light, not the vessel. But the green in the light, the fact that it has a specific form, specific color, that comes from the vessel. So the vessel is actually doing something, not just blocking. And the next part is going to explain another point, which is really the main point of the whole Shaar Hayichud Vehaemunah.
No, just it's very
Yes.
confusing.
Very confusing.
Very.
That means you understood. Okay.
Vessel could have specific color, shape, and form, but vessel consists from the light, and
The vessel
light
contains the light.
contains the light, but vessel itself, what is it?
The vessel itself,
The channel, but what is this? Yeah,
where is it coming from?
yeah.
That's a good question. That's actually the next thing we're going to explain. I said you got it, yeah. So where's the vessel coming from?
Letters.
What?
Letters, right?
Oh, so we're not going to go into the details, but we'll go down the line. The vessels come from the letters. The vessels are the letters. The letters come from the 5 letters. The 5 letters come from the 5 parts. And that comes from the 5 guras. And the 5 guras come from something called Brutzina the Cardoni. So what is this next piece explaining? It's explaining that the power of, like, basically your question is, so where's the colors come from in the first place? Where did the vessels come from to block the light? So the answer is the vessels, that comes from Hashem's power of Gevura, the power to conceal. Let me try to explain what he's saying, and then we'll have to explain how it fits into these words. One of the things that come up, and I think we've had this before in the Maiborim, is that these words, Vaidaita Iyar, we should know today, Ki Hashem Hu Elokim, which means that Hashem, which is Hashem, Havaya is Hashem's power of to give light and to reveal and to be infinite, and Gevura, which is finite, it's all one. Otherwise, what's the meaning of the word? Hashem Hu Elokim, which means God is God. It's like saying you should know that the table is actually the table. The Havdil. God is God. What does it mean? It means like this, that the power to reveal godliness and the power to conceal godliness is absolutely one. Happy to say it's one. They're 2 opposite directions. One is revealing, one is concealing. One is infinite, one is finite. So the answer is that there's an interesting mashal in Chassidus.
Wait, what is the
Hashem Hu Elokim. There's a halacha, a very interesting halacha, that if a man doesn't have a yarmulke, he shouldn't be walking even 4 cubits, But he could put his hand on his head and then he could walk because his head is covered. What if he wants to make a bracha and he has no yarmulke? He can't put his hand on his head and make a bracha. Not good enough.
Put a paper.
He has to have something else.
Paper.
Something that's like not him.
Not him. In fact, if another person would put his hand on my head, I could make a bracha. But if I put my hand on my head, I can't make a bracha. So it's explained in the Maimon why. These are the words. Ein etzem master al etzem. I can't conceal myself from myself. In other words, to put into simple words, let me just finish. Put into simple words, what's the idea of a yarmulke? A yarmulke means there's something above me, something above my head, which is Hashem. That's why yarmulke brings fear of Hashem, and that's why it's called yarmulke. I don't know if you know, the yarmulke is two words, Yorei Melokim. And it became yarmulke, but that's what it's made up of, Yorei Melokim, fear of God. In Gemara, there's a story with someone who came and said that a child is not acting in the proper way. Put a covering on his head, and you'll see that he'll be okay. And that's why even though a yarmulke is something that we wear all the time, is something which came much later, maybe a few hundred years ago, but all the time you're not allowed to walk in the Beis Hamikdash without a head covering. You're not allowed to make a bracha without a head. That's an absolute thing which is not allowed. Why? Because the head covering indicates that I recognize Hashem is above me. So if I put my hand above me, there's still nothing above me. My hand is me. It's an extension of me. In order to be something above me, which means I go up until this point and then there's something more, has to be something else there. My hand is not blocking me. If we understand that Havaya and Elokim both come from the same essence, then Elokim is not really truly blocking Shem Havaya. They're all one. So early in the morning for such deep philosophical things.
Yeah, we need to discuss it too. Yeah.
As long as not 2 a.m. Okay.
Then we're all gonna be tired.
So, just a second, 1 second. So I guess the point is that the power to limit, the power to do all these things is part of Hashem's being infinite. The power for finite doesn't come because in Hashem there's a finite streak, and that's where all the finite comes from. No. The power to conceal, to hide, to limit comes from Hashem being the absolute ultimate infinite. And that's the part which we need to explain. We have to leave you thinking about it all weekend. And then on Monday, Mirza Hashem, we'll have the answer to the question, hopefully. But it basically means that Hashem is so infinite that he can do things in a finite way. Yes, Sharon, what did you want to say?
Like I was seeing like pictures from the space that I came, my Shalia, right? So, and I saw one of the rabbis that he was doing like, he was putting like, I think maybe him and one of the guys, and he was putting like the pocket of the tefillin in his hand, but I think that he was with a kippah.
Of course.
In his head.
No one wears tefillin without a kippah. Of course not.
With a head? He need a
Talis. You put the talis on there.
This is like
Cover.
put it like a head.
Yeah, same idea.
Same idea.
Yeah. Luba, I'm going to ask you something.